It's an honor for me to introduce Dr. George Wald, Nobel Prize winner, because this man has used his platform and what the accomplishments in his science to make his voice a little bigger. There's very little, I hate to be pessimistic, but sometimes I think there's so little hope. There's so little hope with the population and the war thing, but that is the hope, that people with a voice stand up, that we can admire and say it really eloquently. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. George Wald.
Thank you, Tommy Smothers. Thank you for that very generous introduction and your remarks, Mr. Smothers. As I told you, I'm not a watcher, so this is the first time I've laid eyes on a Smother. But a very great pleasure for me. I asked Mr. Niles for the opportunity to speak at this gathering because, though I'm living a strange life now, this is the first time in my life that I've had a chance to speak to executives. I wondered about the title of this organization and whether indeed I'd come to the right meeting. But the little I heard of this morning's proceedings reassured me on that score. The thing I was in doubt about was whether you gentlemen who are only interested in war are also interested in the defense industry and defense contracts, because those are very different things, very different things. I want to say a few words about the Vietnam War today, but most of all, I'm anxious to exploit this opportunity to talk with business people about the defense business. That Vietnam War, what I think of the Vietnam War, I think it's a national disgrace. But when I finish saying that kind of thing, people realizing that I'm that poorest of all things, especially when I don't agree with them at the moment, academic. It's a big discovery. Professors are likely to be academic. They're all right for providing the basis for atom bombs and proximity fuses, but if they begin to talk about how those things are used or whether they should even go on existing, they're academic. So people ask me, you got a plan? You have a program? Yes, I have a program. I'll tell you how to get out of the Vietnam War. In ships. That doesn't even sound academic. It sounds like a thoroughly irresponsible remark. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, it isn't all that irresponsible. I've been thinking of little else than that Vietnam War and how to terminate it for upwards of 5 years. And I've seen all that stuff about phased withdrawal, and believe me, I don't think there's any improvement in practicality or tactics or anything else to the thought, get out now. And I would offer one of those ships to the present government of South Vietnam, who might want to leave when we do. I hope all good Americans know, as they should, that almost every one of those generals who've been running South Vietnam is himself a North Vietnamese. There are North Vietnamese. And the other thing to say about them is much more significant. Every one of them fought on the French side in the Vietnamese Revolution. If you ever worry about why the people of South Vietnam don't seem exactly enthusiastic about that government we've furnished them, this may give you an idea. I'm a teacher, and one of the things I have to worry about all the time is the draft. how the adults of this country ever allowed themselves to have a peacetime draft instituted. That's the most un-American thing that has ever appeared on the scene, I think. Altogether incompatible with what we've always understood America to represent. And when one abolishes the draft, as I dearly hope we will shortly, on that occasion one needs also to cut down drastically the size of our peacetime army, because a big peacetime army also is incompatible with American life and everything America has meant in the past. But that brings me to our business of the day, and that is that thing that Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. We have an issue before us right now, but it's only our immediate issue. It's only an immediate counter in an enormously bigger game, and that is the ABM. That ABM, important as it is in itself, is really most important as signifying a direction in which our still rather new administration is planning to lead the country. The whole world, as well as the people of this nation, were waiting to get a first answer to that question, and Mr. Nixon's decision on the ABMs provided that first answer. There is near unanimity, not only among scientists of every kind, among physicists who come a little closer to the situation, but also among the persons who've come closest to this situation, both through knowing weaponry and anti-weaponry, and also in having served the government. Every single science advisor to a president that we've yet had, with a single exception of Lee DeBridge, who is now serving this role for President Nixon, every single one up till now has come out flatly against the ABM and has not changed his position in the slightest in going from a sentinel to a safeguard program. You can take them off. Kistiakowsky, he was Eisenhower's advisor, science advisor. Jerome Wiesner, provost of MIT. He was Kennedy's advisor. Of all surprising things, Donald Hornig, Mr. Johnson's advisor. I wish he'd spoken up a little earlier, but now he's gone into Eastman Kodak, and I'm very grateful to him for speaking up now. They're all against it. But this wasn't a scientific issue. It wasn't, I think, even primarily a military issue. The center of decision in this situation didn't depend, I think, in any way on whether we needed those ABMs either. It wasn't a scientific decision. It wasn't a military decision. The center of that decision, I'm quite convinced, involved $6 to $8 billion in defense contracts, and that's what made it happen. That's what I think. And that as only an opening. Senator Mansfield, I read in the papers a week or two ago, had made the radical proposal that the defense budget be cut by $5 billion. I'm running around like crazy these days, but I wrote him longhand quick. You know, if you could only up that ante of $5 billion to $30 billion, you could do no greater thing for the youth of this nation. They're not very interested. They can't get excited, nor can I, in the possibility of cutting an $80 billion budget by $5 billion. But if we were told that that was going to be cut by $30 billion, that would be a signal to the whole nation to my students, to the youth of this nation, that it was a new deal, I felt a little embarrassed. Academic, in fact. I'd almost pulled that number 30 billion out of the hat. So it was a relief to me. Last Friday, I attended a meeting here in Washington, and Professor Seymour Melman, professor of industrial engineering at Columbia University, gave a magnificent speech there, and he had written out in utter detail a going over of this coming year's defense budget with detailed proposals for cutting it back by $55 billion. And without any sacrifice whatever, and that's the important point, without any sacrifice whatever of our present defense posture, which is already at an insane level. He has placed that document in the hands of Senator Stennis, who had assured him that he would accept the document and include it within the papers before his committee, though he didn't care to hear from Professor Melman in person. I see you laugh when I mention Senator Stennis. I'd like to say a word more about one of the problems besetting us. You know, I'm 62. When I get to be 65, Harvard University thinks that I'm not to be trusted to go on teaching freshmen and sophomores. But when it comes to heading up one of the major committees of Congress, the older you are, the better. There is nothing as precious to a congressman as his seniority. And I've sometimes thought, what this country needs is an immortal congressman. And some of the Southern congressmen have almost made it. I think the center of decision in that ABM business, those defense contracts, as a preview of how it's going to be in this country in the near future with defense contracts. We Americans have come on hard times, but we're learning. We're learning a few harsh political truths. There is no nation now in this world that so greatly resembles the United States as the Soviet Union. That sounds odd to Americans. Ask some Canadians what they think. The whole world sees it that way. And some Russians see it that way. And all the Chinese see it that way. You know, it's a curious thing. There are some deluded people who think we're still dealing with one communism, but we're dealing with multiple communisms. And if I'm talking with a real hard line, the left wing among the students at Harvard, and I say this, they cheer. They're Maoists. That's what Mao says. But that's also what Andrei Sakharov said. Andrei Sakharov can get away with that when few other Russians could. Because, you see, in this regard, but that I'm about to mention, though not in many others, he's the Edward Teller of Russia. He's the man who's given principal credit for getting the hydrogen bomb for the Russians. He's one of their most brilliant nuclear physicists and one of the younger generation of them. So he can talk. And this is exactly what he was saying in a widely circulated document. That is just what I said, that the United States and the USSR now so closely resemble each other that it's high time they got together for the benefit of all mankind. Well, the arms business, the defense business, so-called euphemistically, is the biggest business in America. penetrates every corner of our lives by now. Every corner of our lives. And ladies and gentlemen, we can't handle it at the grassroots level. We can't handle it at the level of individual decisions. If anything is going to happen to that situation, that $80 billion so-called defense budget, it has to be turned off at the tap. It has to be turned off at the source. Some of my best friends are Nobel laureates. One very old friend, his name's St. Georgi, wonderful man. Albert St. Georgi has a wonderful way of saying in his Hungarian accent some very penetrating things, and I once heard him say, "There are now more men living on cancer than dying from cancer." He was talking to his fellow scientists. It's fantastically true that there are now more people living on weaponry than dying from weaponry. Fantastically true. But only in those periods between the wars that we choose to go on regarding as normal. Those wars have begun to come in something like a 20 to 30 year cycle. And the next one, that I hope won't come, but that I'm afraid will more than redress that balance. It's a matter of short-term prosperity weighed against long-term disaster. And I think that's the choice that is before us and before American businessmen and before American professors and all of us, including American workers and their leaders in the labor unions. Because the unions are in it, too. And so I suggested a while back, we have to now speak of the military-industrial labor union complex. I'm sad to say that. Please don't anyone make the mistake of thinking that I'm anti-union. I've lived my whole life looking to the unions for backing of progressive legislation and progressive movements of all kinds. This is a deep blow, but not to leave this with just statistics, because statistics are always a little dull. I'll tell you a little recent local development in this regard. It's quite astonishing. The students at MIT, those students have been pressing on MIT to dissolve its relationships, its direct relationships with the Defense Department. MIT runs something called the Lincoln Laboratories, and they do work for the Defense Department. And MIT lately responded to this pressure by saying that it was beginning to phase out its relationship with the Lincoln Labs. I want to tell you an astonishing development of just a couple of days ago. The Building Service Employees International Union Local 254 AFL-CIO, with 6,500 members, has filed a civil suit in federal court against MIT and its president, Howard W. Johnson, not the sandwiches and clam roll Johnson. This is the president of MIT, seeking to bar them from discussing the phasing out of Lincoln Laboratory until they take up the matter with the union. There are those students who, for highly idealistic reasons that seem proper to them, are trying to get MIT out of the defense business and look as though they're beginning to succeed, and they're being fought down by a union. So, as I say, I think if anything is to be done to cope with this situation, it must be done at the source. And now I want to come to my real message to you. It's not really a message. It's a disguised question, because what I'm about to say, you will know ever so much better than I. You see, it's another part of the mythology of liberal intellectuals that what you do in this kind of situation is to convert. It's all simple. You take that $30 billion that would go into armaments and you devote it to satisfying human needs. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? But that's what I want to talk about. Because those human needs, what are they? Well, we need a lot more housing in this country, and better housing. We need a lot more schools and better schools. We need better health care and health facilities. We need clean air and clean water. We have to restructure the cities. Not a single one of those things, not a single one of those things makes a multi-billion-dollar defense contract that you can plant in some suburb in California or Texas and hand over to one of these super colossal outfits that's now making the armaments. They're not built for that kind of job. They can't rebuild our cities. They can't even, and have looked into it and decided, no, not their job. Mass transportation, another thing we need. Not their job. They're geared to make sophisticated weaponry and electronic guidance systems and all that stuff. I used to wonder, I think maybe some of you would be surprised to know how many scientists don't think much of the aerospace program. It may be a lot of things, but it isn't bringing in very much science. I want to tell you that. So I've been rather against it as a way of spending that much money, and I wondered why, as intelligent and socially minded a president as Kennedy started that program to get to the moon. I think this is why. I think that Kennedy saw very clearly, though he didn't care to say it just that way, that the only even semi-peaceful kind of project that will produce those multi-billion-dollar contracts that are just for this kind of outfit is aerospace. I was a little surprised to hear Tommy Smothers, because I thought he was a humorist, speaking of his dismay and dejection. I want to say just a word about that. We've got a lot to be dismayed and dejected about, but I think you respond in either of two ways. Either you despair or you become angry. It's my temperament to become angry. That's what keeps... I find I'm very angry. Whenever I begin to speak, I start quietly, and I find that rage just boiling up in me as I go on talking. I get angrier and angrier, and that's all that keeps me happy. So what I want most to say to you, and that's it. That's the message. I want to say that we have to divert all that money that's now simply being wasted. Much worse than being wasted. It's threatening our lives and our futures. It's making the futures of our young people in this country and all over the world empty, blank, hopeless. They don't see, to coin a phrase, any light at the end of the tunnel. And what I want to say is, we have to divert that huge defense budget to meeting human needs. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to hurt. It's going to hurt a lot. It's not only going to hurt some big capitalists, presumably they'll live. It not only going to hurt a lot of investors who may find they aren't getting the returns on their investments they might have got, an awful lot of working men who would have to find other jobs in other places. And being human and being well brought up in our system, they're going to fight that very hard. And their unions are going to fight it. And I've just given you an example of that. So it's not an easy problem. It's not going to be easy. It's going to hurt. And yet there's an enormous positive side. And that's what I'd like this organization, before all organizations, to get about. An enormous positive side. Because we don't want to spend less federal money. We want to spend more. We want to spend all those sums and more. But that's a different kind of job. And that money has to be spent, if it's to satisfy human needs, by much smaller businesses and more locally. It's to bring that money home. That, I think, is the proper business view of that situation. And I hope you can promote it. Thank you.